There are names in history that survive through monuments, victories, or reforms, and then there are those whose names survive only because they were erased. Julia Livilla was a Roman noblewoman, born into the center of the empire, surrounded by marble halls, triumphal processions, and whispered betrayal. She was the niece of Tiberius, the sister of Caligula, and the target of accusations that shifted with each regime. Her life, pieced together from damaged inscriptions and veiled references, reveals a world where power was private and silence was enforced. At the heart of her story lies a charge so severe, so destabilizing, that it was never spoken plainly: incest with an emperor. Whether manufactured or real, the accusation sealed her fate. But behind it, deeper patterns begin to emerge. This is not a story about scandal. It is a study in erasure, in what Rome chose not to remember and why. A dynasty of control. The Julio-Claudian line. The Julio-Claudian dynasty was Rome's first imperial family. Spanning from Augustus to Nero, it ruled the Roman Empire for nearly a century. Beneath its administrative reforms and cultural advancements lay a domestic structure shaped not by affection, but by strategy. Birth, marriage, and death within the household were extensions of imperial policy. Every relationship served the state. Autonomy, particularly among women, was often secondary to dynastic needs. This model began with Augustus, born Gaius Octavius, in 63 BCE. Following Julius Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Augustus secured power through alliances, military loyalty, and the calculated construction of family ties. In 27 BCE, he became Rome's first emperor, officially retaining the title princeps, or first citizen. To ensure continuity, he used marriage as a tool of governance, linking his household with Rome's most influential families, Claudii, Livii, Antonii. Women within the imperial orbit were arranged into marriages not for companionship, but to legitimize claims, pacify factions, or contain potential threats. Livia Drusilla, Augustus's third wife, was key to this configuration. From the prestigious Claudian family, she brought two sons into the union, Tiberius and Drusus, who became part of the Julian line. Although Augustus attempted to groom other successors, including his grandsons Gaius and Lucius, their early deaths left Tiberius, Livia's son, as the surviving heir. In 14 CE, Tiberius became emperor, uniting both sides of the Julio-Claudian name. Tiberius's ascent was marked by detachment and suspicion. Ancient sources like Tacitus and Suetonius describe him as withdrawn and reluctant to rule. Still, he maintained a clear understanding of succession. Dynastic strength depended on absolute control, not just of provinces and armies, but of family. Women in the inner circle, daughters, sisters, nieces, were essential to this control. Their bodies and reputations were assets to be guarded, exploited, or discarded depending on political conditions. Roman law granted the paterfamilias, the male head of a family, broad authority over all members. This included power over life and death, a right amplified in the imperial household. In the Julio-Claudian context, the line between family discipline and state enforcement was non-existent. Moral charges such as adultery, treason, or incest could be applied flexibly. A domestic accusation could lead to exile, imprisonment, or execution, especially when aligned with imperial objectives. The exile of Julia the Elder, Augustus's only biological daughter, in 2 BCE exemplified this model. Accused of adultery and conspiracy, she was removed from public life despite her position as the mother of potential heirs. Her daughter, Julia the Younger, was similarly exiled a few years later. These episodes served as cautionary examples. Imperial women were not above political purging. The trend persisted under Tiberius. Tiberius's rule reinforced the convergence of familial closeness and political risk. His nieces, including Julia Livilla, were born into a structure that treated kinship as both a privilege and a liability. A niece could be instrumental in securing a marriage alliance, but just as easily become a scapegoat if her presence threatened the throne's stability. Under Augustus, the dynastic project relied on arranged marriages. Under Tiberius, it evolved into one of controlled isolation and heightened surveillance. Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century, observed that the imperial palace functioned more like a garrison than a household. Informants were commonplace, trials occurred in secret, executions were discreet. The women of the dynasty, wives, daughters, and nieces, lived in constant exposure to imperial authority, their fates subject not to their own actions, but to political circumstance. In such a system, rumor alone could carry fatal weight. The legacy of dynastic control continued under the emperors who followed. Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. Women like Agrippina the Younger, Messalina, and Octavia would later face similar fates, married for advantage, accused of betrayal, and ultimately eliminated. But it was under Tiberius that the framework solidified. His retreat to Capri, the manipulation of his advisor Sejanus, and the fate of his niece Julia Livilla formed the foundation of a darker shift in Julio-Claudian rule. By the end of the 1st century CE, the imperial family had become a machine of succession and suspicion. Trust was scarce. Obedience was enforced. Loyalty was transactional. In such a world, even the relationship between an uncle and a niece could become a battleground for control. The dynasty left behind temples, roads, and reforms, but also a record of how absolute power, when turned inward, could consume its own blood. The rise of Tiberius. Power, paranoia, and isolation. Tiberius Claudius Nero was born on November 16, 42 BCE, into the patrician Claudian family, one of Rome's oldest aristocratic lineages. His early life was marked by political reshuffling. His mother, Livia Drusilla, divorced his father and married Octavian, soon to become Augustus, in 38 BCE. This positioned Tiberius close to power, but without clear succession prospects. During Augustus's rule, Tiberius remained outside the main line of succession. Augustus prioritized his biological descendants, particularly his grandsons Gaius and Lucius Caesar, born to his daughter Julia and Marcus Agrippa. Tiberius served with distinction in military campaigns across Pannonia, Armenia, and Germania, gaining respect for discipline and command. However, he was not viewed as a central figure in the imperial future. In 6 BCE, Tiberius voluntarily retired to Rhodes. The reasons remain debated. Some sources cite court tensions and rivalry with Agrippa's sons, others suggest dissatisfaction or calculated withdrawal. Regardless, the retreat removed him from public life. He returned only in 2 CE, having played no official role during those years. By 4 CE, the deaths of Gaius and Lucius changed Augustus's plans. With no remaining biological heirs, he adopted Tiberius and declared him successor. But Augustus insisted on one condition: Tiberius must adopt Germanicus, his nephew by blood, to continue the Julian line. This made Tiberius both heir and placeholder, tasked with preserving dynastic continuity while bridging to the next generation. When Augustus died in 14 CE, Tiberius became emperor. He inherited a functioning administrative state, stable provinces, loyal armies, and a senate trained in deference. Tiberius maintained institutional continuity but never pursued popularity. His accession speech to the Senate was deliberately hesitant, inviting the body to debate his fitness. Contemporary historians like Tacitus interpreted this as insincere posturing. Tiberius's governance emphasized restraint. He avoided spectacle, limited imperial expenditures, and rarely appeared in public festivals. He delegated provincial responsibilities and limited military adventures. But his distance created discomfort. Where Augustus had built consensus through appearances and symbolism, Tiberius relied on control and detachment. The result was a growing perception of coldness. The death of his son Drusus in 23 CE marked a turning point. Tiberius became increasingly withdrawn. Trust diminished. The emperor began using treason trials, maestas cases, to prosecute senators and rivals. While the law predated his reign, its expanded use created an atmosphere of quiet surveillance. Informants became common, and accusations spread easily. Amid this climate, Lucius Aelius Sejanus rose to power. As Praetorian prefect, Sejanus commanded the imperial guard. He consolidated influence, moved the guard's barracks closer to the city, and eliminated political obstacles. Tiberius supported him, even permitting the betrothal of Sejanus to his niece. In 26 CE, Tiberius withdrew permanently to Capri, effectively ceding daily power to Sejanus. Villa Jovis, his residence on Capri, became the new center of command. The island allowed Tiberius to remain in control without returning to Rome. Letters were dispatched, decrees issued, and trials ordered, all from a remote location. Ancient sources speculated about debauchery, but consistent records focus more on isolation and distance from civic life. During these years, Sejanus intensified purges. Senators, equestrians, and members of the imperial family were arrested or executed under suspicion of conspiracy. The Senate, uncertain whether Tiberius endorsed these actions, offered little resistance. Power accumulated in Sejanus's hands. The emperor's silence became complicity. In 31 CE, Sejanus was abruptly arrested and executed by order of Tiberius. The reasons remain unclear. Some suggest betrayal. Others cite growing ambition that alarmed the emperor. Whatever the cause, Sejanus's fall left a vacuum. Tiberius did not return to Rome. Instead, the regime became more cautious, more opaque, and more centralized. Tiberius ruled until his death in 37 CE. By that time, he had alienated the Senate, withdrawn from the people, and left few trusted allies. Though the empire remained intact, his reign was defined less by expansion and more by suspicion. Under his rule, imperial power had become inward-facing. This legacy would directly affect his family. Women within the Julio-Claudian line, including his niece Julia Livilla, lived within this world of secrecy and surveillance. The imperial court was no longer just a political center, it had become a mechanism for quiet removal. The consequences of Tiberius's rule did not end with his life. Julia Livilla, a niece born to a fallen hero. Julia Livilla was born in 18 CE into a family defined by status and danger. Her father, Germanicus Julius Caesar, was celebrated in Rome for both his military successes and his public appeal. As the adopted son of Tiberius and a grandson of Mark Antony, Germanicus was viewed by many as the natural successor to the principate. His sudden death in 19 CE, while stationed in Antioch, possibly due to poisoning, shook the empire and left his children politically vulnerable. Julia Livilla was only an infant. She was the youngest of 6 children born to Germanicus and Agrippina the elder. Among her siblings were Caligula, who would later become emperor, and Agrippina the younger, who would go on to be the mother of Nero. The legacy of Germanicus loomed large. His popularity made him a symbolic alternative to Tiberius, and his widow's vocal challenges to imperial authority further increased tensions. Agrippina's confrontations with Tiberius placed the entire family under suspicion. After Germanicus's death, the children of his household were not protected by their noble birth. Instead, they became subject to surveillance. Tiberius's growing isolation and distrust toward Germanicus's descendants created a hostile political environment. When he withdrew to the island of Capri in 26 CE, control of Rome passed increasingly to figures like Lucius alias Sejanus, who intensified scrutiny of potential rivals, including members of the imperial family. In 29 CE, Agrippina the elder and her son Nero Julius Caesar were arrested and exiled. Julia Livilla, still a child, remained in Rome, but the event demonstrated that proximity to power offered no immunity. The family's past service to the empire did not safeguard them. Their survival depended less on merit and more on perceived loyalty. The rise of Sejanus brought a wave of purges. Senators, equestrians, and imperial relatives were accused of conspiracy and treason. Julia Livilla survived, likely because she had not yet reached a politically active age. Nevertheless, the fate of her mother and brothers remained a clear warning. Even noble birth could become a liability. Following the death of Tiberius in 37 CE, Caligula ascended to the throne. As the emperor's sister, Julia Livilla was elevated within the imperial household. She received public honors, appeared on coinage, and re-entered the political world that had once threatened her. Her marriage to Marcus Vinicius, a man from a prominent senatorial family, was both a social bond and a strategic link between the court and Rome's elite. During Caligula's reign, however, palace life became increasingly unstable. His behavior, described by ancient sources as erratic and cruel, destabilized the political order. Caligula's unpredictable decisions and purges created a climate of fear, even for those closest to him. Julia Livilla's status, rather than protecting her, once again made her a target. In 39 CE, Julia Livilla and her sister Agrippina the Younger were accused of conspiring against the emperor. The details of the charge remain vague. Some sources suggest they were involved in a plot to replace Caligula with a different relative. Others propose that the accusations were simply manufactured. Regardless, Julia Livilla was exiled to the Pontine Islands, a common destination for political banishment. After Caligula's assassination in 41 CE, Claudius was declared emperor. Julia Livilla was recalled from exile and briefly restored to court life. However, her return coincided with the rise of Valeria Messalina, Claudius's third wife, whose influence at court was considerable. Messalina's reputation for eliminating perceived rivals raised concern for many, particularly women of noble birth. Not long after her return, Julia Livilla faced new charges, this time of adultery with Seneca the Younger. Whether the accusation was factual or politically motivated remains unclear. Claudius responded by exiling her again, and according to later accounts, she was soon executed under Messalina's orders, likely through enforced starvation. She died around 41 or 42 CE, at approximately 22 years old. Julia Livilla's life, though short, reflected the hazards of being born into the imperial household. Her status as the daughter of a fallen general and the sister of an emperor made her valuable and dangerous in equal measure. From childhood to death, her fate was decided not by her actions, but by her placement within a dynasty where family ties were often weapons in political survival. The island fortress, Villa Jovis, and the secrets of Capri. In 26 CE, Emperor Tiberius left Rome and relocated to the island of Capri, marking a permanent shift in the operation of imperial authority. The decision puzzled many in the capital, but for Tiberius, it was a calculated retreat. Capri was not just a place of exile from public life. It became a controlled environment from which the emperor could govern without immediate Senate interference. At the center of this retreat stood Villa Jovis, a sprawling compound perched atop the island's cliffs, both isolated and heavily fortified. Capri, located in the Bay of Naples, had been favored by Augustus, who appreciated its climate and seclusion. Tiberius inherited this appreciation, but expanded it into a system of rule. Construction of Villa Jovis likely began around 23 CE and continued into Tiberius's occupation. It became the largest of at least 12 villas he maintained on the island, covering over 70 square meters and built across steep terrain. The structure included a sophisticated system of water cisterns, private quarters, administrative rooms, and observation points that overlooked the sea in all directions. The architecture of Villa Jovis served more than aesthetic purposes. The complex was strategically designed to restrict access. Its elevation provided visibility of approaching ships, while narrow, controlled entryways limited intrusion. Guard posts were situated near cliff edges. The villa was part palace, part fortress engineered for surveillance as much as residence. For Tiberius, who increasingly distrusted the Senate, military officers, and even his own family, it provided a buffer against perceived threats. The island itself was not a complete escape from administration. Tiberius issued edicts, received correspondence, and maintained communication through trusted intermediaries, most notably Lucius Aelius Sejanus, his praetorian prefect. Sejanus managed affairs in Rome, while Tiberius remained distant, creating a dual structure of power. While the emperor ruled by letter, Sejanus used his position to suppress opposition, consolidate control, and extend influence over appointments and prosecutions. Ancient writers portrayed Capri as a place of both retreat and decadence. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio describe scenes of moral decline and cruelty, including allegations of sadistic punishments and predatory behavior. These accounts, written after Tiberius's death, are difficult to verify. Some modern historians argue that the stories reflect senatorial hostility toward an emperor who had withdrawn from traditional public engagement. Nevertheless, the consistency of accusations across sources suggests that Villa Jovis became a symbol of opaque governance and unchecked authority. One of the villa's more unsettling features was its proximity to steep cliffs. Suetonius claims that Tiberius ordered those he condemned to be thrown from the cliffs into the sea below. Whether or not this was standard practice, the villa's layout made it feasible. The isolation of the site meant that actions taken within its walls could go unreported or unchallenged. The cliffside, in this context, functioned not just as a boundary, but as a mechanism of disposal. Capri's transformation under Tiberius had implications beyond the island. The emperor's retreat weakened the symbolic role of the princeps as a public figure. Absent from Rome, Tiberius was no longer seen presiding over ceremonies, consulting the Senate, or leading military triumphs. His silence created space for rumor and suspicion. With Sejanus as the visible authority in Rome, the distinction between emperor and administrator blurred. For the imperial family, This environment was especially dangerous. Julia Livilla's later fate cannot be separated from the culture established at Villa Jovis. The court that emerged during Tiberius's absence operated under conditions of surveillance, accusation, and strategic exile. Capri was not merely a personal sanctuary. It became a model for remote rule supported by controlled violence and fear. The mechanisms put in place during these years would outlast Tiberius himself, influencing how future emperors dealt with internal threats. Although Villa Jovis fell into disrepair after Tiberius's death in 37 CE, its legacy endured. The image of an emperor governing in isolation, detached from Rome, yet still wielding absolute power, marked a departure from the more visible leadership style of Augustus. The physical fortress atop Capri came to symbolize a broader transformation of the Principate into something colder, more distant, and less accountable. For the imperial women still within the machinery of power, the villa represented the growing impossibility of safety, even in silence. The Emperor's Court of Shadows. By the late 20s CE, the Roman imperial court had transformed from a political stage into a place of concealed influence, private accusations, and unrecorded decisions. With Emperor Tiberius governing from Capri, the visible structures of power in Rome grew murky. Formal assemblies continued, senators still convened, and magistrates performed their duties, but actual authority had shifted into private rooms, sealed letters, and secret informants. This court of shadows allowed the emperor to govern without direct presence, while maintaining a climate of uncertainty. At the center of this transformation was Lucius Aelius Sejanus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard. Appointed to this post in 14 CE, the same year Tiberius assumed the Principate, Sejanus gradually accumulated extraordinary influence. Initially subordinate to the co-prefect, his rise accelerated after the death of his colleague in 15 CE. By 17 CE, Sejanus operated as the sole commander of the elite force, tasked with protecting the emperor, placing him in direct control of the only standing troops within the city of Rome. Sejanus's strategy included both structural and personal reforms. In 23 CE, he convinced Tiberius to consolidate the Praetorian Guard into a single fortified camp on the outskirts of the city, the Castra Praetoria. This centralization gave Sejanus not only a powerful urban military presence, but also a stronghold for intelligence gathering, political surveillance, and coercive enforcement. With Tiberius's increasing withdrawal from public life, Sejanus became the de facto gatekeeper of imperial access. Inside the imperial household, Sejanus maneuvered through personal alliances. He cultivated relationships with the emperor's confidants, proposed marital connections with the imperial family, and offered loyalty to those he secretly sought to undermine. Following the death of Drusus Julius Caesar, Tiberius's son, in 23 CE, Sejanus emerged as the most trusted figure in the emperor's circle. Ancient sources suggest he may have even played a role in Drusus's death, although conclusive evidence never surfaced. By 26 CE, with Tiberius's permanent relocation to Capri, the structure of the court changed entirely. Administrative decisions, legal rulings, and personnel appointments were carried out in the emperor's name but funneled through Sejanus. Petitioners approached Sejanus, not Tiberius. Accusations of treason or disloyalty were managed by his office. Executions could be authorized without the emperor ever being seen. A new form of governance emerged, one rooted in distance, secrecy, and the elimination of dissent through preemptive suppression. This court of shadows operated under the growing use of the lex maestatis, the law of treason. Originally designed to protect the dignity of the Roman state, it had, by the honest century CE, evolved into a political weapon. Speech, association, and even silence could be interpreted as acts against the emperor. Letters were intercepted, statements reinterpreted, and private conversations brought forth in secret trials. Witnesses were often rewarded. Accused individuals had little opportunity to defend themselves. Under Sejanus's influence, the court no longer required public confrontation, only quiet compliance or removal. The women of the imperial household were particularly vulnerable. Without official political roles, their reputations were subject to manipulation. Accusations of sexual impropriety, conspiracy, or treason were difficult to disprove. The exile of Julia the Younger, the destruction of Agrippina the Elder's household, and the eventual targeting of Julia Livilla occurred within this same climate of engineered disgrace. Their guilt mattered less than the utility of their removal. Even members of the Senate, Rome's traditional elite, adjusted to this new environment. senators began issuing preemptive condemnations of accused colleagues to demonstrate loyalty. Some avoided public speech altogether, fearing misinterpretation. The court became not a place of counsel, but of performance where silence or enthusiasm could be equally dangerous. Tiberius, informed by letters and reports, maintained the appearance of justice, but from afar. The machinery of power had become self-sustaining. The atmosphere in Rome changed. Public ceremonies became rare. Trials were delayed or held in private. Executions came without warning. This uncertainty served a purpose. It kept everyone cautious. No one knew what might provoke the emperor's anger, or whether he had ordered anything at all. Julia Livilla came of age in this environment. Her birth gave her status, but also danger. Her fate would be decided not in public forums, but in the quiet spaces where whispers replaced law and silence became the sharpest weapon. The arrival of Julia, a political pawn, Julia Livilla, returned to court in 41 CE, following the assassination of her brother Caligula and the sudden elevation of her uncle Claudius to the imperial throne. Her reappearance was not marked by triumph or restoration of honor, but rather by quiet recalibration. She had spent the final years of Caligula's reign in exile on the Pontine Islands, accused of conspiracy, along with her sister Agrippina the Younger. Now, she entered a Roman court that looked stable on the surface, but was governed by shifting alliances and opportunistic actors. Claudius, despite his scholarly reputation, was no reformer of dynastic structures. He inherited the legacy of his predecessors and continued the practice of using familial relationships as instruments of control. Julia Livilla's return was likely orchestrated not from compassion, but calculation. Her presence served several purposes. She was a visible tie to the revered Germanicus, a connection to the Julian line that Claudius himself did not possess directly. She could lend legitimacy to a regime still viewed by many as accidental or transitional. At court, Julia Livilla's position was ambiguous. She was honored with public recognition, but her movements were monitored. Her reappearance coincided with the increasing influence of Empress Messalina, Claudius's third wife. Messalina, though young, had already established a reputation for political maneuvering. Ancient sources depict her as ruthless, protective of her status, and quick to act against perceived rivals. In this environment, Julia Livilla's proximity to power became both her asset and her vulnerability. Her previous marriage to Marcus Vinicius, a respected senator and consul, may have provided temporary insulation. Vinicius had remained in Rome during her exile and was not implicated in any conspiracies. His loyalty to the regime was unquestioned, but his influence was limited, and he could not protect her once accusations resurfaced. According to Tacitus and Suetonius, Julia Livilla soon became entangled in rumors of adultery, an accusation frequently used in the imperial family to justify removals. This time, the charges implicated a more prominent figure, Lucius Annaeus Seneca, the Stoic philosopher and orator. Seneca had been gaining attention for his rhetorical skill and cautious alignment with imperial favor. The exact nature of their alleged relationship remains unclear. Ancient historians differ. Some suggest genuine affection. Others claim political fabrication. What is consistent is that both were punished. Seneca was exiled to the island of Corsica. Julia Livilla faced a harsher sentence. By 42 CE, she had been exiled once more, this time with no prospect of return. The charge of adultery served its function. It removed a woman with dynastic blood from court, without requiring evidence of political rebellion. Her execution followed soon after. Sources vary, but most report she was starved to death on the orders of Messalina. No official trial was held. No Senate decree recorded her sentence. She simply disappeared, her fate sealed within the private mechanisms of palace authority. Julia Livilla's death marked a return to the patterns established under Tiberius. Accusation, exile, and elimination had become standard tools in managing imperial relatives. Her crime was never clearly stated, but her position made her expendable. She had been useful as a symbol, dangerous as an individual. The court of Claudius had no room for women with lineage and ambition unless their interests aligned precisely with those of the empress. Her erasure was swift. No temple dedication, no funeral procession, no commemoration in marble. Her name was excluded from inscriptions. Her image was withdrawn from circulation. For a dynasty obsessed with visibility and memory, the act of forgetting could be as powerful as a formal execution. Behind closed doors, the politics of kinship continued. Claudius turned to his freedmen advisors. Messalina consolidated power further. Agrippina the Younger, Julia Livilla's sister, waited. And the mechanisms that controlled royal women moved on, one pawn removed, others in place, the game unchanged. Julia Livilla's brief return to court, her symbolic value, and her ultimate disposal illustrate the role noblewomen played in Julio-Claudian politics. They were not actors in their own right, but pieces to be deployed, silenced, or sacrificed as the moment required. In the imperial household, survival required more than lineage. It required invisibility or perfect obedience. Julia had neither. Imperial violations, hidden reports of abuse. The inner workings of the Julio-Claudian court were concealed behind layers of ceremony, protocol, and silence. What occurred in private rooms rarely appeared in public records. Yet scattered fragments, remarks and letters, veiled accusations in Senate debates, and second-hand accounts in later histories point to a darker reality. Imperial power was not only administrative and military, but also intimate and absolute. Within the imperial household, no one was beyond reach. And for royal women like Julia Livilla, proximity to the emperor could mean exposure to coercion that left no formal record. Tiberius, during his final years on Capri, was increasingly removed from Rome. The island's high cliffs and guarded pathways made it a secluded stronghold. Visitors were few. Orders were issued through intermediaries. It was during this period that the first rumors of sexual exploitation emerged. Ancient sources such as Suetonius and Tacitus allude to disturbing patterns of behavior, unnamed boys and girls, taken from noble houses, kept for entertainment, and then dismissed or silenced. The accounts are vague, often filtered through political hostility, but they appear with consistency. Julia Livilla, a niece with dynastic lineage, spent time at court during and after this period. The details of her interactions with Tiberius remain undocumented, but her exile under Caligula and later under Claudius was preceded by whispered accusations of shamelessness and inappropriate ambition. The language is coded. Ancient Roman texts rarely describe assault in direct terms when involving high-status men. Instead, blame was often displaced onto the women portrayed as seductresses, conspirators, or threats to the moral order. Several letters preserved in the writings of Seneca and Pliny the Elder suggest that imperial women were often placed in roles where refusal was not an option. Consent, in these cases, was not formally withdrawn because it was never meaningfully granted. Status offered no protection. The closer a woman was to the emperor, the more likely she was to become a target. Behind layers of obedience, silence became a strategy for survival. Caligula's reign intensified these patterns. His treatment of his sisters Julia Livilla, Agrippina the Younger, and Drusilla became a matter of public spectacle. He included them in ceremonies reserved for magistrates, referred to them in terms normally used for spouses, and allegedly housed them within the imperial quarters. Inscriptions from 37 and 38 CE depict his sisters as part of the Principate, which ancient writers interpreted as symbolic incest. Whether or not physical relationships occurred, Caligula's elevation of his sisters was designed to provoke and destabilize established norms. Suetonius records that Caligula boasted of sleeping with all three sisters, though no contemporaneous source corroborates this. Still, the perception alone was enough to damage reputations. Julia Livilla, already marked by her earlier exile, became the subject of repeated insinuations. In this environment, guilt did not require evidence. Association was enough. A woman's closeness to power was interpreted as complicity, even when the structures around her offered no safe alternatives. When Julia Livilla was accused of adultery under Claudius, the charges were presented as matters of morality. There was no mention of coercion, no defense of her vulnerability within a court that silenced dissent. Her alleged relationship with Seneca was treated as betrayal, not of her husband, but of imperial discipline. The absence of protest in the historical record does not mean the absence of harm. It means there were no words that could be safely spoken. By the time of her final exile and death, Julia Livilla's name had become a symbol of disorder within the imperial court. The accusations against her were framed as personal failings, ambition, shamelessness, betrayal, without acknowledging the power structures that dictated her circumstances. Emperors arranged her marriage, controlled her movements, and shaped the narrative of her downfall. Punishment was presented, as moral correction. Any abuse, coercion, or silencing was concealed beneath ritual, protocol, and the illusion of justice. Official records rarely documented such violations. Instead, the truth surfaced only in fragments through patterns of exile, sudden disappearances, and charges couched in moral language. In this system, violence did not always involve force. It could be exercised through expectation, control, and public shaming. Julia Livilla's story reflected a broader reality. She was not alone. Countless imperial women lived and died within a world that left them no safe words. Only silence that history rarely broke. Sejanus falls, but the secrets remain. The fall of Lucius Aelius Sejanus in 31 CE marked a turning point in the political landscape of the Roman Empire. As the powerful prefect of the Praetorian Guard, Sejanus had effectively controlled access to Emperor Tiberius during the latter's self-imposed retreat to Capri. For years, he orchestrated purges of rival elites, tightened surveillance over the imperial household, and expanded his own influence in the Senate and across provincial administrations. His eventual downfall was sudden, orchestrated by Tiberius through a secret letter to the Senate, read aloud in a tense session, that quickly descended into chaos. Sejanus's execution was followed by a rapid dismantling of his allies. Trials, suicides, and confiscations swept through the capital. Families that had once stood close to power were stripped of property and titles. The reach of his network, once invisible, now became a source of public horror. But while his political machinery collapsed, the systems he refined remained in place. The mechanisms of surveillance, silence, and strategic accusation did not vanish. They simply shifted hands. The imperial household, in particular, did not escape the shock. Sejanus had been closely involved in managing access to the family of Germanicus Agrippina the Elder and her children, including Julia Livilla. His policies had helped engineer their isolation after Germanicus's death. Agrippina, once seen as a potential empress, was publicly accused of conspiracy and exiled to the island of Pandateria in 29 CE. Her sons, Nero Julius Caesar and Drusus Caesar, were also targeted, imprisoned, and eventually died under suspicious circumstances. After Sejanus's fall, these imprisonments were not reversed. Agrippina remained in exile until her death, reportedly from starvation, in 33 CE. Her sons did not return to court. Julia Livilla, still a young girl, stayed in Rome, but the danger had not passed. Tiberius's rule became more withdrawn, more unpredictable. The purges continued. The machinery of fear that Sejanus had directed did not die with him. It had already become institutional. Senators who had once allied with Sejanus now struggled to reframe their loyalty. Some were executed despite sudden declarations of innocence. Others denounced former colleagues to distance themselves from suspicion. In the absence of public transparency, rumors filled the void. Whispers of documents destroyed, witnesses silenced, and coercion within the imperial family increased. The power vacuum left by Sejanus was not filled by reform, but by an intensification of secrecy. It is in this context that the imperial treatment of women, particularly those of Germanicus's lineage, must be understood. The fall of Sejanus did not restore order, it solidified the conditions of paranoia. Julia Livilla, as a daughter of Agrippina and sister to Caligula, was both protected by her bloodline and endangered by it. Her survival during these years may have owed more to youth and invisibility than favor. Older members of the dynasty were eliminated under the pretense of morality or conspiracy. Younger ones, like Livilla and her sister Agrippina the Younger, learned to operate within the narrow spaces left to them. The long-term effects of Sejanus's administration were evident in the persistence of these tactics under later emperors. The use of charges like adultery, treason, and impiety to remove rivals became standard. Trials took place behind closed doors. Exile became a sentence for both guilt and convenience. Political repression acquired the language of moral correction, blurring the line between crime and dissent. Even after Sejanus's name was removed from inscriptions and his statues pulled down, the fear he cultivated remained. The Senate, which had once cheered his promotions, now lived in cautious compliance. The Praetorian Guard, though under new leadership, retained its expanded influence. Tiberius continued to rule from Capri, increasingly isolated, issuing commands through letters and intermediaries. Few dared question his decisions. Those who did often vanished without record. For Julia Livilla, The legacy of Sejanus was not just historical, it was structural. The court she inhabited as she matured had absorbed the habits of surveillance and silencing. Any misstep, real or perceived, could be interpreted as subversion. Even familial ties offered no security. In the aftermath of Sejanus's fall, a lesson had been imprinted onto the court. Proximity to power demanded total obedience, and suspicion alone could justify removal. The tools remained in place, only the names changed. An empire without witnesses. The Julio-Claudian Empire did not lack laws, scribes, or records, but its most consequential decisions were often made in silence. In the imperial household, there were no public minutes, no transcripts of conversation, no witnesses allowed into the inner chambers of influence. Those who did serve inside the freedmen, slaves, attendants rarely left written testimonies. What occurred in private was designed to stay there. It was an empire of surfaces, where ceremony obscured what power truly did. By the time Julia Livilla reached adulthood, this culture had become fully embedded. Even within the palace walls, truth was fragmented. Orders were given without attribution. Messages arrived unsigned, or carried through trusted intermediaries. Servants learned to look away. Women, even of the imperial bloodline, were expected to know their roles without speaking them aloud. Proximity to the emperor granted visibility, but not safety. The closer one stood, the more easily they could vanish. Exile was a common solution. It was clean. No need for public execution or lengthy trial. A charge, vague or fabricated, could be whispered into a senator's ear. A decree might follow. A ship dispatched to a coastal outpost. Julia Livilla knew this well. Twice exiled, once under Caligula and once under Claudius. Her movements were dictated not by justice but by convenience. The process required no witnesses because none were permitted to see the mechanisms at work. During her exile to the Pontine Islands in 39 CE, few records survive. No formal sentence remains. No public proceedings are archived. The accusation complicity in a plot against her brother Caligula was broad enough to allow silence. What she endured there, what she thought or feared, is absent from the historical record. The isolation was not just physical, it was procedural. The absence of observers was the point. This approach extended beyond her. Roman imperial governance in the 1st century CE increasingly favored control without explanation. Trials were postponed indefinitely. Evidence was not presented. A senator might be summoned and never seen again. A noblewoman might vanish from public life. Her name omitted from festivals. Her likeness removed from coinage. The system worked not through spectacle, but through erasure. When Claudius assumed power after Caligula's assassination in 41 CE, hopes for a more stable and visible government briefly emerged. Claudius reintroduced certain public rituals, opened court sessions, and sought the favor of the Senate. But his reign soon reverted to the same hidden patterns. Julia Livilla's return from exile was short-lived. By 41 or 42 CE, she was accused again, this time of adultery, with Seneca the Younger. The process moved quickly. No public rebuttal, no open defense. Seneca, too, was exiled, though he would later return. Julia Livilla was not so fortunate. She reportedly died by forced starvation, possibly under the order of Claudius, or at the instigation of his wife Messalina. The manner of her death was consistent with the court's need for silence. Starvation left no wound to explain. There was no spectacle, no funeral, just absence. Roman historians struggled with this lack of documentation. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio all mention Julia Livilla, but with limited detail. They echo accusations, cite rumors, imply scandal but offer little beyond hearsay. The structure they were writing about resisted clarity. When power moved without witnesses, even history became speculation. The imperial women were the most affected. Their movements were not recorded in official dispatches. Their voices were excluded from Senate debate. Their reputations were shaped almost entirely by those who opposed them or needed them forgotten. A sister of the emperor could disappear without inscription. A niece could die without eulogy. The result was a historical record filled with shadows. This condition served the empire well. By refusing visibility, emperors avoided accountability. Policies could change without explanation. Alliances could shift overnight. Fear was not maintained through constant violence, but through the possibility of being erased. Julia Livilla's life, framed by 2 exiles and a quiet execution, was not an anomaly, it was a method. What survives of her life comes only in fragments, passing mentions, coins, indirect letters. No first-hand account, no diary, no confirmed portrait. She lived at the empire's core, yet left almost nothing behind. In a world without witnesses, memory served power, and those who remembered often chose silence instead. The charge of ink, Saint, manufactured or confessed. The Roman world had no shortage of scandal, but charges of incest, especially among the imperial family, carried an intensity beyond most other accusations. In honest century Rome, incest was more than a moral violation. It was a breach of the sacred order that the imperial family was meant to represent. When Julia Livilla became the subject of such allegations, it was unclear whether the charge reflected a personal scandal, a political strategy, or a calculated act of erasure. Julia Livilla's relationship with her brother, Emperor Caligula, had been publicly emphasized during his reign. Coins minted during the early 30s CE depicted Julia and her sisters Agrippina and Drusilla alongside the emperor, elevating them to a position previously unseen for women in Rome. Some inscriptions name them as part of the emperor's Domus Divina, a divine household. This was not mere flattery. It was a signal of central authority being concentrated within a family unit that blurred traditional lines. By 39 CE, rumors of incest began to appear in Roman sources. Suetonius, writing decades later, claimed that Caligula lived in habitual incest with all his sisters. Other historians, like Cassius Dio, echoed similar themes, though none could cite direct evidence. The language used was formulaic and reflective of Roman anxieties. Sexual deviance in the imperial family was often shorthand for political instability. Julia Livilla, by then already in a vulnerable position, became a focal point. Her presence in Caligula's private quarters, her involvement in ceremonies usually reserved for consorts or co-rulers, and her earlier exile all formed the groundwork for suspicion. Ancient writers do not clarify whether the charge was ever officially brought before the Senate or whether it remained in the realm of rumor. But the impact was the same. Her name became entangled with incest, regardless of proof. In 41 CE, following Caligula's assassination, Claudius became emperor. Julia Livilla briefly returned to court, but the damage to her reputation had already been done. Her association with Caligula and the whispered rumors of incest followed her. Even without formal conviction, the label persisted. The Roman public had already absorbed the narrative, and the Senate rarely challenged it. For high-born women, perception was often equivalent to guilt. Under Claudius, Julia was again accused this time of adultery, with the philosopher Seneca. But the earlier allegations of incest were not forgotten. They lingered as part of her identity, weaponized to reinforce her role as morally suspect and politically dangerous. The connection to incest made it easier to justify subsequent punishments, including exile and execution. Once a woman had been framed within that narrative, there was little chance of public redemption. The question remains, was there any confession? No official records mention one. There is no surviving documentation from Julia Livilla herself. No testimony, no defense. If a confession ever existed, it likely came under coercion or was constructed after her death. The practice of forced confession, especially in cases involving political crimes, was common in imperial Rome. Statements could be extracted under pressure or simply invented by imperial scribes to justify state actions. There is also the issue of symbolic accusation. In Rome, incest could be invoked metaphorically. It didn't always denote a literal relationship, but could signify an unnatural closeness, especially when a woman exerted influence beyond what was considered acceptable. Julia Livilla's involvement in imperial rituals, her proximity to power, and her refusal to retreat into obscurity all contributed to a narrative that branded her dangerous. The charge of incest may have served more as a symbolic expulsion than a literal accusation. Ultimately, the incest charge illustrates the weaponization of morality within imperial politics. Accusations could be unprovable, contradictory, or fabricated, yet they remained effective. Once a woman was marked by such a charge, her removal could proceed with little opposition. Julia Livilla's downfall did not require evidence. It only required the suggestion of impropriety, amplified by her closeness to emperors who had more to gain by removing her than by defending her. She was not the first to face such charges, and she would not be the last. In the Julio-Claudian household, Incest accusations became a recurring theme levied against mothers, daughters, and sisters when their presence at court grew inconvenient. Whether the charge was manufactured, metaphorical, or based in distorted perceptions, its purpose remained constant: to isolate, discredit, and eliminate. Execution by hunger. A death without outcry. When Julia Livilla was exiled for the final time in 42 CE, the charge was adultery. But the circumstances surrounding her exile, and what followed, suggest a punishment that extended far beyond any proven transgression. According to several ancient sources, she was not executed in a traditional sense. No blade, no public sentence. Instead, she was left to starve. Quietly, deliberately, and without official notice. The order, most historians agree, came from Empress Valeria Messalina, wife of Claudius. Messalina had developed a reputation for eliminating rivals within the imperial household, especially women with noble bloodlines or potential claims to influence. Julia Livilla, as the daughter of Germanicus and sister to Caligula, remained symbolically dangerous even after years of disgrace. Her exile was not a political formality, it was the prelude to removal. Suetonius, writing decades later, notes that Julia was put to death by starvation, a method that required no executioner. Tacitus offers fewer details, simply noting her banishment and death. The manner of her execution by hunger was not unprecedented in Roman elite circles. It served a specific function. Starvation created no public spectacle. It avoided direct bloodshed. It did not leave a wound for the people to observe, or for the Senate to question. A death without outcry, carefully contained within the private geography of imperial punishment. The island, to which she was sent, was likely one of the Pontine Islands, the same chain used during previous exiles. These islands, scattered in the Tyrrhenian Sea, were small, rocky, and sparsely populated. There were no witnesses beyond a few guards and household staff. Supplies could be stopped with a single order. Isolation did the rest. Roman exile was not always meant to be fatal, but in Julia's case, that line was crossed with intent. No formal charges were revisited. No trial was convened. There was no public reading of guilt. Her death was not officially recorded as an execution. It was categorized as a disappearance. In the imperial vocabulary, this allowed Rome to maintain the illusion of moral order. A woman who had been accused of indecency and treason simply faded from the record, her silence interpreted as proof of wrongdoing. There was no surviving letter from her, no recorded plea. Whether she resisted, fell ill, or succumbed quietly remains unknown. This absence is part of the method. To starve someone was not merely to end their life, but to erase their agency. It removed the moment of confrontation. The condemned person became a passive figure, reduced to a dwindling body in a locked room. For women, especially those tied to dynastic politics, this kind of disappearance became common practice. Messalina's involvement is assumed rather than confirmed. Ancient authors hostile to her memory frequently placed blame at her feet for court purges, whether or not she issued the orders. But her power during Claudius's early reign was real. She controlled access to the emperor, managed rivalries within the palace, and ensured that potential threats were neutralized before they could gather support. Julia Livilla, as a surviving link to Germanicus and a former companion of Caligula, was one such threat. The use of starvation also preserved plausible deniability for Claudius. He could maintain the image of a ruler unaware of domestic cruelty, while his court operated with lethal efficiency. Julia's death served both political and symbolic functions. It eliminated a rival and demonstrated that the imperial household could extinguish even its own members without leaving a mark. Her body was not paraded. There was no tomb constructed in her name. No cenotaph survives. The absence of memorial suggests a deliberate effort to prevent martyrdom. In Roman tradition, even disgraced figures were often buried with ceremony. Julia received none. The silence around her death became part of its effectiveness, a method of punishment designed not only to kill, but to unright. In the years that followed, other women in the imperial household, Agrippina the Younger, Octavia, Livilla, would face similar fates. The details varied, but the strategy remained consistent. When a woman became too dangerous to ignore, but too visible to try openly, she would be disappeared through starvation, exile, or quiet suffocation. Julia Livilla's end was not an exception. It was a refinement of a system already in place. The Senate's silence. Complicity through procedure. The Roman Senate, once the heart of the Republic, had by the 1st century CE become a body defined more by ritual than resistance. While it retained the outward trappings of legislative power, debate, voting, decrees, its capacity to check the will of the emperor had diminished. In cases like that of Julia Livilla, the Senate did not order her exile or her death, but neither did it oppose them. Its silence was not passive. It was procedural, structured, and deliberate. Julia's final condemnation under Emperor Claudius followed a familiar formula. Charges were introduced indirectly, often through intermediaries within the imperial court. In her case, accusations of adultery were sufficient. There was no trial as a modern audience would understand it. The Senate did not summon witnesses or permit defense. Instead, guilt was embedded in the motion itself, framed as a matter of public morality and imperial stability. The body's role was to affirm, not question. Senatorial records from the early 40s CE offer few details on Julia's fate. The official Acta Senatus, edited under imperial oversight, included only outcomes, not deliberations. Her name may have appeared in a list of offenders to be removed from court, but there is no surviving decree directly naming her execution. This absence, like her death, was part of the design. It preserved the appearance of order, the emperor was protected from scrutiny, and the Senate preserved its role as guardian of tradition, while avoiding direct responsibility. Many senators at the time owed their positions to the emperor's favor. Since Augustus, the Senate had been slowly repopulated with loyalists, men whose wealth, ancestry, or provincial ties made them dependents of imperial goodwill. To oppose an imperial decree, even privately, risked expulsion, confiscation, or worse. In this environment, silence was a form of preservation. Not agreement, not ignorance, just survival. Cassius Dio and Tacitus both describe the Senate under Tiberius and Claudius as cautious and controlled. Motions were often pre-written, dissent was rare and coded. When senators resisted, they did so by delaying votes, abstaining from applause, or raising procedural questions, not by openly challenging imperial commands. In the case of Julia Livilla, no such resistance is recorded. Her exile and execution proceeded without protest, in part because the framework allowed no room for it. The Senate had long mastered the art of complicity through formality. Imperial decisions were cloaked in ceremony, presented as restorations of virtue, expressions of ancestral values, or responses to public concern. Julia's removal was likely justified under the Lex Julia de Adulteris, a law originally meant to uphold marital fidelity among the elite. By applying this statute, the court could treat her as a moral failure rather than a political target. The Senate, in turn, was merely endorsing the law, preserving its image as the guardian of Roman ethics. Behind closed doors, some senators may have understood the deeper implications. Julia was not a criminal. She was an inconvenient symbol. Her bloodline, her presence at court, and her connection to Caligula all made her a liability. But the mechanisms in place required only the appearance of process. Once a charge was introduced, adultery, impropriety, conspiracy, it was enough. The Senate did not need to confirm the details. It only needed to agree that the charge, if true, would justify her removal. The structure discouraged inquiry. Asking questions implied doubt. Doubt implied disloyalty. And disloyalty, especially under Claudius and the influence of Messalina, could end a political career or a life. So the Senate remained procedural. Motions passed. Accusations stood. Punishments were enacted without open debate. By the time Julia Livilla died, the Senate had normalized its role as facilitator of imperial will. The transformation was nearly complete. Once a counterbalance, it now functioned as a stage where decisions made elsewhere were performed as if by consensus. In that performance, Julia Livilla's fate became routine. Her disappearance was not shocking. It was processed, ratified, and forgotten. Remembering through absence. Damnatio memoriae. Damnatio memoriae was not a formal sentence like exile or execution. It was a process, slow, bureaucratic, and deliberate. When applied to members of the imperial family, it served a specific function, not simply to erase, but to control the memory of those deemed dangerous to recall. For Julia Livilla, the act of removal did not end with death. It extended into how she would or would not be remembered. There are no surviving statues of Julia Livilla with confirmed inscriptions. Reliefs that once depicted the daughters of Germanicus were recut. Names on dedications were chiseled away. Bronze coinage minted during Caligula's reign once featured the faces of his sisters, Julia Livilla among them. But these coins were melted down in later years and replaced by issues that excluded her entirely. What could not be physically destroyed was reinterpreted, explained away in later histories as symbolic, scandalous, or mistaken. Memory was not only manipulated, it was curated. The process of erasure left behind its own kind of evidence. Where her name once appeared, there are scratches. Where her image once stood, there are gaps in official records. These voids do not prove innocence or guilt. They prove she existed, and that her existence became inconvenient. In Rome, forgetting someone required labor. Scribes, sculptors, and archivists were involved. A missing name on a restored monument was rarely the result of oversight. Incomplete inscriptions suggest intentional removal, not decay. The motivations for damnatio memoriae varied. In the case of senators or generals, it was often political, a warning to their allies. For women of the imperial family, the erasure served a more private function. It severed uncomfortable associations. It closed questions that could not be safely asked. Julia Livilla had been close to multiple emperors. Her downfall implicated Caligula and shamed Claudius. Leaving her memory intact risked inviting doubt toward the regime that outlived her. Erasing her removed the need to explain her. Ancient writers, such as Tacitus and Suetonius, mention her name only in passing. Their accounts preserve fragments, but do not linger. When they do refer to her, it is almost always in relation to the men who surrounded her: Germanicus, Caligula, Seneca. She exists within their narratives, not her own. Her intentions, her loyalties, her voice, none of it was preserved. She is described through accusation, never through personal record. Damnatio memoriae did not erase personal memory. Those who had known her servants, friends, family, may have continued to speak her name in private, but it removed the official version. It denied her a place in Rome's public story. Her likeness could not be shown. Her name could not be listed in dedications. Her life could not be commemorated in speech or inscription without risk. To remember her openly was to challenge the judgment of the emperor. The mechanics of forgetting were recursive. Once removed from records, future generations had less to remember. Historians decades later would find only partial references, charges without context, deaths without explanation, figures without statues. In this vacuum, Julia Livilla became a placeholder for disorder. She was remembered not through deeds, but through accusation. Her legacy became what was said about her, not what she said. This absence shaped more than just her memory. It shaped the cultural understanding of imperial women. Those who vanished through exile, execution, or damnatio came to represent danger. Their stories became cautionary. Their erasure reinforced the idea that female proximity to power was inherently suspect. Each name struck from the record made it easier to strike the next. It created a template for forgetting. Julia Livilla's name appears in only a handful of surviving inscriptions. Most are damaged or incomplete. A funerary inscription from a freedwoman in Gaul includes a dedication to the household of Germanicus, a vague reference, possibly to Julia or her siblings, but nothing bearing her full name remains intact. No tomb, no marker, no confirmed portrait, no official acknowledgement of her existence that survived unaltered. And yet, the attempt to erase her created a trace. Each record scratched out, each statue replaced, each coin withdrawn, marked where she had once been. These gaps speak not only to her removal, but to her presence. Rome could not fully unmake her. It could only teach itself to stop looking. Whispers in the sources. What ancient historians feared to say. Ancient Roman historians wrote under the shadow of empire. Their works, though often rich in detail, were shaped by personal risk, political allegiance, and the limits of what could safely be preserved in writing. In the case of Julia Livilla, what was left unsaid reveals as much as what survives. The gaps in the historical record do not reflect a lack of interest. They reflect fear, censorship, and the politics of memory. Tacitus, writing during the reigns of the Flavian and Antonine emperors, was unusually candid in his criticisms of imperial excess. Yet even he mentions Julia Livilla only briefly. In his annals, she appears as one among several women punished for immorality charges. that are not examined, only listed. Tacitus provides no defense, no inquiry into the motivations of her accusers. He states that she was executed at the behest of Messalina, Claudius's wife, but does not explore the context in which this occurred. The reason is not necessarily disinterest. Tacitus himself had served under the emperors. There were limits to how deeply he could probe. Suetonius, whose Lives of the Caesars reads more like biography than formal history, includes scandalous detail when describing Caligula. He recounts rumors that Caligula had sexual relationships with his sisters, naming Julia Livilla among them. But the tone is one of sensationalism rather than investigation. Suetonius does not weigh the plausibility of these stories, nor does he attempt to verify them. They are presented as court gossip impossible to confirm, dangerous to deny. Julia Livilla is cast in the role of a participant, not a victim. The question of coercion is never raised. Cassius Dio, writing later in Greek under the Severan dynasty, includes a broader narrative, but relies heavily on earlier sources now lost. His references to Julia Livilla are minimal and vague. He echoes claims of adultery, rivalry, and disobedience, but without detail. Like others before him, he confines her to the margins of his account. Dio's omissions reflect a broader trend. The closer a woman's downfall was tied to imperial shame, the less her story was examined. The pattern suggests caution, not neglect. Historians knew the danger of interrogating imperial motives too closely. The charge of maiestas, or treason, extended to speech. To defend someone convicted of treason was itself a risk. Even decades later, to revisit the guilt of a woman erased by damnatio memoriae might invite scrutiny. Better to report the accusations and move on. In private correspondence and philosophical treatises, additional hints appear. Seneca, exiled under Claudius and later a tutor to Nero, never mentions Julia Livilla by name in his surviving works. Yet his exile was linked to an alleged affair with her. He alludes to false accusations and the cruelty of court life, but does so in abstract terms, whether out of fear, loyalty, or political strategy. He avoids directly addressing the woman whose downfall had once shaped his own. Even inscriptions and official documents are marked by their silence. No surviving funerary inscription from the Claudian period names Julia Livilla. No senatorial decree exonerates her or records the proceedings that led to her execution. In Rome, erasure was often more lasting than condemnation. This silence shaped the historical legacy of imperial women. In place of documentation, their lives were reconstructed from rumor. Accusations were preserved, but their voices were not. The absence of personal letters, legal testimony, or court records leaves their intentions forever obscured. For Julia Livilla, this means that her portrayal is determined almost entirely by the perspective of male writers aligned with the imperial regime or constrained by its memory. Modern scholars face the same dilemma. To understand what may have happened, they must read between the lines, examining phrasing, omissions, and the broader political climate in which these texts were composed. In doing so, a different pattern emerges. It is one of fear, not clarity. Historians feared the consequences of telling too much. They feared naming those who had ordered the silencing. They feared the consequences of empathy. The image of Julia Livilla is fragmented, accused, erased, and seen only through others' words. Her life was shaped by dynastic control, and what historians feared to say was not just her guilt or innocence, but the system that silenced both. A dynasty devours itself. The legacy of imperial abuse. The Julio-Claudian dynasty began with promises of stability, unity, and the restoration of Rome's greatness. But by the time Julia Livilla's name was stricken from records, the structure that had once claimed divine lineage had turned inward. It consumed not only its enemies, but its own family. The imperial household, once a symbol of Roman continuity, had become a system of surveillance, suspicion, and quiet elimination. Its legacy was not just in the monuments built or territories conquered, but in the lives taken apart silently within palace walls. Germanicus, father to Julia Livilla, had been the great hope of the Roman people. Beloved by the legions and publicly praised by Augustus, his early death in 19 CE created a vacuum of trust. The imperial succession that followed did not restore order. It introduced a cycle in which family ties became liabilities. Bloodline offered legitimacy, but it also invited jealousy and preemptive retaliation. Tiberius distrusted the sons of Germanicus. Caligula eliminated rivals under the guise of maintaining authority, Claudius used exile and execution to manage perception. In each generation, survival required either distance from power or complete submission to it. Women bore this instability in specific ways. Without formal political power, they existed as symbols of continuity, fertility, honor, or shame. Their marriages were arranged for diplomacy. Their reputations were tied to the image of the emperor. A rumor, a letter, an association could end a life. Julia Livilla's fate mirrored that of other imperial women. Livilla, accused of poisoning her husband. Messalina, executed after being declared disloyal. Agrippina the Elder, starved in exile. Each was accused of transgression, and each removal served to reinforce imperial control. The structures that supported these decisions were bureaucratic, not violent in appearance. The Senate passed motions with little debate. Trials occurred in private. Charges were stated in abstract terms: immorality, disloyalty, ambition. These were not crimes in the modern sense, but reflections of perceived threat. Once declared dishonorable, a person could be removed without resistance from institutions designed to uphold their erasure. The later reigns of Nero and Domitian would continue these practices, though with different public styles. By then, the damage had been done. The imperial family was no longer seen as a cohesive unit, but as a stage on which suspicion, alliance, and betrayal played out predictably. Even surviving members lived under constant observation. The memory of those removed lingered not in praise, but in cautionary tales. Julia Livilla, once part of imperial ceremony, was later described only in terms of scandal. Her image reduced to a lesson in what not to be. The mechanisms of control used against her were not extraordinary. They were normalized. Letters intercepted, names struck from stone, testimonies coerced or destroyed. What appears to modern readers as a clear pattern of abuse was, in its time, the accepted cost of maintaining power. The dynasty could not admit vulnerability. It required silence, not truth. The machinery that eliminated Julia Livilla continued to function long after her death, applied again and again to those whose presence disrupted the narrative. There were no monuments raised for the women who disappeared this way. No public commemorations marked their lives, but their absence became part of the imperial landscape. Each removal shaped who could be trusted, what could be said, and how history would be remembered. The lack of direct evidence is itself a result of the process that destroyed it. When later historians compiled lists of emperors and their households, they struggled to account for those figures who had been removed but never fully forgotten. Julia Livilla appears in some family trees, but without detail. Her name is mentioned in trial records, but without defense. Her face does not appear in confirmed busts, yet fragments of altered inscriptions imply where she had once stood. She was not remembered fully, nor entirely erased. The Julio-Claudian dynasty ended with Nero's suicide in 68 CE, collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. What began as a promise of stability unraveled into cycles of suspicion and purges. Rome no longer trusted its emperors or their kin. Julia Livilla's fate became emblematic of this decline. She did not fall through rebellion or ambition, but through silence and erasure. Her life marked how easily someone could vanish not for what they had done, but because the system required someone to vanish.